What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the latest interpretation of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a show coming to Amazon on Friday, February 2nd, with all 8 episodes dropping at once. And I'll be keeping this review mostly spoiler-free, although toward the end of the video, I'm going to need to break that rule, but I'll give you fair warning in advance. But I must admit that I was a little surprised to see that Amazon was going with the binge model for this show, because usually with their shows like Reacher or The Boys, they'll kind of whet the appetite of the audience by dropping 2 or 3 episodes on day one and then teasing out the rest 1 week at a time. It's just a way of kind of keeping your ratings up and also just keeping the conversation going if there's enough material to discuss in between episodes. But I was also surprised to see that Amazon kept the review embargo in place until so late, until 24 hours before the show dropped, because they sent me these screeners weeks ago. So much so I was like, oh shit, I need to get on this. I need to start watching these episodes. Like, wait a second. I was like, I have a month to do this. But at times, not always, a late embargo is a potential sign of trouble. Sometimes people are just trying to hide spoilers or big plot twists and that sort of thing. But I suspect that Amazon realized on some level this is not a guaranteed smash hit. Like, the first episode is incredibly strong and it absolutely got me on the hook. And it had a really specific tone that I think people are going to immediately embrace. And I think if the entire season were as strong as the first episode, it would be one of the biggest shows of 2024, hands down. But it's got a few limp episodes and it's got a few recurring problems throughout the season that I think will, at least when it came to my own personal taste, prevented me from totally embracing it. But we'll get to all those details in a bit. Let's start with the basics. Mr. and Mrs. Smith is a fresh twist or a fresh spin on the 2005 Doug Liman movie starring Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, which I did see in the theater. I believe that's still the biggest success of Doug Liman's career. But the show is not to be confused with the Alfred Hitchcock movie, the exact same name, from 1941, but the show was created by Francesca Sloan and Donald Glover, and also stars Glover alongside Maya Erskine as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, the husband and wife team working as spies and eventually assassins for this mysterious organization that may or may not have their best interests at heart. And I think when the show's really flowing, it's very enjoyable. It has this kind of effortlessly cool, laid-back style that's lightly humorous, but with a vague threat of danger that I really enjoyed. And it can be risky when a show's going for kind of an understated, very specific style of both action and humor. It reminds me of when you're hanging out with a group of friends where they've got a lot of inside jokes, or they've got a specific way of speaking around one another, and you may or may not immediately be able to get on that wavelength. But what's cool about this kind of laid-back, humorous style is that every once in a while, the action will spike or the danger will spike. And at those times, the show will turn into a full-blown action series. So tonally, the show, it might be a little hard to pin down for some people, but for my part, I like it when genre entertainment isn't quite as easy to categorize. And Glover and Erskine, they enjoy some incredible chemistry. You can tell that they spend a lot of time together, or a lot of time rehearsing, or maybe they're just really good actors, but they have this kind of effortless, easygoing charm when they're just chilling in Washington Square Park and, following a mark, or whatever the case might be, where there's just a nice flow state between the two of them, the way they interact and the way they work as a team. But the show also has some amazing surprise appearances by some other actors that I really like Paul Dano or Parker Posey. I mean, Parker Posey, I grew up watching the movies that she did with Richard Linklater and obviously Hal Hartley. Hal Hartley and Parker Posey in the 90s were an indomitable duo, and the episode where Parker Posey is featured prominently is a strong contender for the best episode of the season. So yeah, that first episode, as well as I won't say when the Parker Posey episode is, but those 2 episodes are definitely this show putting its best foot forward. But I think the most interesting quality of the show is showing the different stages of a relationship, from the early days of the early infatuation where you're constantly having sex all the time and totally in love and that sort of thing, up through the inevitable petty grievances and sources of resentment that inevitably plague most relationships. And I think if you're watching the show with your significant other, don't be surprised if you find yourself getting in pretty heated arguments over whether or not Mr. or Mrs. Smith is more justified when it comes to what they might be fighting about in any individual episode, because over the course of the season, those sources of tension inevitably escalate. And when you're talking about a couple where they're trained to kill people in hand-to-hand combat or with weapons or explosives or whatever, your normal kind of husband-wife arguments can get much more dangerous and much more destructive when they have the capacity to beat the fucking shit out of each other. But I think overall the show works, and when compared with the hundreds of other bland, interchangeable TV shows that are created in any given year, this show is definitely a standout, and even better, it ends with a nice juicy cliffhanger that should leave its fans clamoring for more. But, ... I do have a few critiques and a few issues that continue to bother me. So first of all, as much as I like the kind of mellow, cool, detached speaking style of the central characters, there are times where they take it to such an extreme, or like the show's trying a little too hard to be too cool for school. It ends up feeling a little bit inert and uneventful, even if the characters are right in the middle of like a chase scene or a shootout or some globe-trotting adventure. And there's no getting around the fact that the show has the inevitable peaks and valleys of any show. You've got your strong episodes and you've got your forgettable episodes, but my main problem with the show, I think it's the execution of the action, where you can tell the writers and directors on this show, they're better with character-driven dramas, they're better with lighthearted humor. Maybe they are less, maybe they're less talented when it comes to showing people beating the fuck out of each other, because I feel like the battle of the sexes between Donald Glover and Maya Erskine, it's at its best when it's just them like hanging out in the kitchen and kind of, I guess like with any couple, sometimes choosing to misinterpret what the other person is saying, or you're in the mood to fight, and so you're just looking for a reason to have a knockdown, drag-out brawl, or like at least a battle with words. Basically, the mix of love and hate that any couple is likely to experience on any given day. But I think the two stars and the show overall are much less convincing when it comes to the actual nuts and bolts of action, like hand-to-hand combat, shootouts, chase scenes, basically all the spectacle that you expect from a concept like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And initially I thought that was going to be kind of what is part of the show's charm. Like, they're not trying to be James Bond. They're not trying to be Jason Bourne. They're not trying to be, the biggest badasses in the world. They're everyday people who are following people and gathering information, doing surveillance, delivering packages, like doing things that feel pretty realistic or pretty doable by just about anybody. And then part of the charm of the show, or part of the comedy of the show, is watching as these jobs inevitably force the two characters to adapt in surprising ways, especially when they get sent on one international mission that gets excessively violent very, very quickly, as is teased in the trailer. Because as depicted in their early episodes, these are two people who basically they have nowhere else to go or nowhere else to turn. They need the work, they need the money, and so they have found themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Smith doing these strange, odd jobs for this shadowy organization. And I think part of the comedy of the show is imagining either yourself or couples that you know in these situations and how they would react. And I feel like that very narrow but very specific tone is where the show really excels. But where the show gets into trouble is when we're expected to take it too seriously, or when they are trying to depict these two characters as the world's biggest badasses, because it's just not believable. And just to give you a few examples, you're constantly being presented with scenes where these characters who are slowly but surely being forced down our throats as like the world's greatest assassins, but we'll see them in action scenes where they're firing at people with a fucking machine gun at point blank range and not hitting them. It's like, all right, well, something's gone wrong here. Or watching them do something simple like applying a rear naked choke, but in the laziest, sloppiest way possible, where a beginner on day one in their Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class could easily escape it. But it's like, yeah, that's not a scary assassin. That's a beginner. That's a white belt who doesn't even know what they're doing. I'm not going to find them compelling or believable as these total badass assassins doing, larger than life things. And I get that as the season progresses, they wanted to raise the stakes and raise the sense of danger. But as the show gets increasingly serious, I found it increasingly less compelling and less enjoyable to watch. And the show has all these annoying recurring traits that become increasingly annoying as the show progresses. Like the couple, they're constantly preoccupied with this argument over who is smarter. And I get it. It's the battle of the sexes. Couples fight about all kinds of stupid shit, but like it gets to the point where like every line of dialogue in the show is about how Maya Erskine's character is so intelligent. And I just wanted to say to the writers of the show, like, think back to the smartest people you've ever met in your life, whether that's your teachers or your boss or some author that you admire, whatever the case may be, whoever you find to be the most intelligent people in history. Are they intelligent because they constantly told you how intelligent they were, or are they intelligent because it was self-evident? And it's like, no matter how many times you tell me that Mrs. Smith is some super genius, I'm just not buying it unless I see her do super genius stuff. And when it comes to Mr. Smith, the show has the reverse problem where they're constantly trying to depict him as incompetent or stupid or with like suffering from this desperate need to feel safe. And if you don't want any spoilers, cover up your ears or bail out on the video. But for the next 30 seconds or so, I'm going to have to go into some spoiler terrain because there's a major dramatic scene toward the end of the season where they go deep into the fact that Mr. Smith always needs to feel safe. And I'm like, are we watching some coming-of-age high school drama? Or are we watching a show about spies who are paid on a regular basis to kill people, follow people, deliver bombs to their doorstep, and that sort of thing? I'm sorry. If you are basically a serial killer for hire, I doubt feeling safe is going to be your foremost concern. Like, if anything, you'd have the reverse problem of being a total fucking psychopath. And I almost turned off the show because there's like this 10-minute scene about how he needs to feel safe with the most loathsome dialogue imaginable. And I was like, do I even want to review the show? Like, I was enjoying the show so much early on, and that scene just about broke me. And I feel like even if this revelation about his character is incredibly important to the writers of the show, at a minimum, say it in a fresh, original way. I feel like any writer that's worth their weight, they're not going to use tired cliches or oft-repeated phrases that feel more appropriate for like a vice principal giving a lecture to middle school students about not being mean in class and that sort of thing. As Martin Amis would describe it, like that kind of language, it's dead freight. And to me, nothing makes a writer seem less imaginative or less creative or less original than when they rely upon the attitudes often expressed by people suffering from groupthink. I feel like groupthink is a plague upon showbiz, whether it's TV, film, music, video games, whatever. If you have an entire group of people that think alike and write alike and use the same phrasing, well, then it starts to make every story feel the fucking same. So once again, long story short, if you want to turn your major hero of the show into the world's biggest pussy, at least try to do so in a fresh, original way. But just to get back into positive territory, one thing the show does really well is giving different missions that allow the couple of Mr. and Mrs. Smith to explore different aspects of their relationship at different stages, whether that's the early infatuation or talks of kids or long-term plans or whatever the case might be. But they'll be involved in some life or death struggle, but in the context of the characters that they're observing and like listening to their arguments, it will almost kind of hold up a mirror to their own relationship. And so there's definitely some imaginative stuff going on, definitely some interesting writers. I feel like the writing staff is probably the writing stuff is not all created equal when it comes to this show, but it seems like Francesca Sloan and Donald Glover wrote at least a good chunk of the episodes. I'm looking at the Wikipedia entry, and so Francesca Sloan and Donald Glover wrote the first episode and the last episode, and then they sometimes work together and sometimes work apart. So who knows, maybe my complaints all go back to the two of them. But I guess when it comes to my own personal taste, I think the show made a mistake or a strategic error by trying to take itself too seriously. The fact that it was constantly kind of poking fun at itself and employing lighthearted humor in the earlier episodes, I think that's where the show was really shining. Like just little things like when a couple suddenly starts using babe at the end of every sentence, where like we've all visited couples where suddenly they're just saying babe all the time. It's like, stop saying babe every fucking word. Like, we get it, y'all are a couple, like you're involved. But like little stuff like that allows us to laugh at the character's expense, and it's enjoyable. It's fun. Like you can tell, like Donald Glover and Maya Erskine had an absolute blast working together, but I feel like the show would have really benefited from bringing in some assistant directors or second unit directors who are more accustomed to shows or movies like John Wick. I feel like if the action had been a little bit more convincing, then I probably would have had fewer complaints, because when you're watching choreography and you're seeing the actors kind of like slowly hesitate because maybe they're a little late, maybe they're a little early, but like the timing's off and you can tell like, oh, like nobody's actually hitting each other where the craft is too evident. And that recent show, Echo, had a similar situation where like someone would like throw a kick and they would pause and then finish the kick because the choreography just wasn't quite locked down. And nothing's going to destroy the verisimilitude of an action show faster than lackluster, shitty action that's not remotely compelling or believable. And people who like action tend to watch a lot of action. Like if you watch a lot of MMA or you watch a lot of like classic shoot 'em ups from like the 60s and 70s, like whatever the case may be, like action fans tend not to just be like casual action fans who watch the occasional show or movie. They watch tons, and so as a result they become connoisseurs and they have very high standards. So it's like either let the show be totally lighthearted and funny, then no one will give a shit. But if you're gonna demand that the audience takes the stakes seriously and that we feel like, anxiety over the inevitable fates of the characters, well, then you need to bring your fucking A game when it comes to guns, car chases, fight scenes, whatever. Because one thing I can't stand is when I'm asked to believe in something that is obviously not the case just from what I'm seeing on the screen. If somebody's supposed to be the biggest badass, well, then they need to fight like a badass. But if they are fighting like somebody who is unathletic, well, then I'm immediately kind of like I guess the illusion is dispelled or the illusion is ruined. When somebody's athletic or when somebody's dangerous, it is obvious, because even if they're just brushing their teeth or getting up from a chair, like, whoa, that person has the capacity for violence. They have that explosive athleticism. And I'm sorry, neither Donald Glover nor Maya Erskine are physical specimens when it comes to running, punching, kicking, etc., which would have been totally fine if the show stayed lighthearted like the earlier episodes, because if it's lighthearted, nobody cares if you can't throw a punch. Nobody cares if you can't run quickly. But if you're going to make me, if you're trying to pretend as if they are Jason Statham throwing roundhouse kicks toward the end of the season, well, then once again, you have to bring your A game or the whole thing just kind of falls apart. So overall, I'd just say my feelings on this show are mixed. It's one of those things where the more I talk about it, the more I realize just how annoyed I was by certain scenes. But goddamn, that first episode, I said it before and I'll say it again, it's fucking awesome. When I first saw that first episode, I was like, oh my God, I've got early access to one of the shows that's going to be one of the big shows of the year. And when you have a great first impression of a show and you're really into something, you can almost kind of willfully blind yourself to a show's flaws or to a movie's flaws because you want it to stay good. But if we're being honest, Mr. and Mrs. Smith just does not stay good. And I'm not necessarily married to the interpretation of the 2005 film. I don't even remember liking the 2005 film all that much. The only thing I really remember about it is that is when Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie became Brangelina and became the big celebrity couple. But otherwise, I kind of have chosen to forget everything about that movie. But I think Mr. and Mrs. Smith is going to be a bit of a Rorschach test, because I think depending upon your attitudes when it comes to the battle of the sexes, that will definitely inform the way you're like, wait, that person's right and that person's wrong, or holy shit, that person's being really annoying. And I do think that is going to be part of the fun of the show, is seeing how the relationship squabbles of the central characters are going to spill over and make the audience almost kind of complicit in the emotions being experienced. So well worth a look, but just keep your expectations modest. It's not a great show, it's a good show, and I think it's important to remember the distinction between a good show versus a great show, and that's all I've got to say about that. So I hope you enjoyed this review. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.